Hi everyone, good day to you from Perth, Western Australia. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel entitled Heightened Expectations, Policy of Diversity, Sculpting a Changing Sector. And before I commence proceedings and give you some more details, I just want to obviously do an acknowledgement. All of us here from different parts of the world, different parts of Australia, we all in different locations of Australia, so it's a really exciting time. And on behalf of my esteemed panel members, I'd like to begin the session by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in Perth. We've got the Darug, Ira, Darawal, and Wiradjuri peoples, the Turrbal, Jagera peoples, and the Gadigal and Bidji Dal peoples. They're the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, admittedly in different parts of Australia. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So if we go after that, I'll just introduce myself, Steve Mackay. I'm the Dean of the Engineering Institute of Technology. We're a dual sector provider, so we do both ASQA and TEXA, and we provide diplomas all the way up to Doctor of Engineering. And we reach students in 160 countries using our innovative and interactive online platform, which we launched about 15 years ago. So we a little bit have been in the online space. We have operations in Perth, Melbourne, and Johannesburg, and London, and Montana, of all places. And obviously, the purpose of this session is to showcase diversity. And as I'll discuss shortly, it's a very powerful feature, and I think we obviously will have an incredible panel ahead of us. So the diversity we're going to look at is diversity generally, but also over the last 20 months. And as I said, I've got a really talented group of speakers, and they will give you some inspiration, but also a toolkit of stuff to go away with, rather than just a general talk fest. And hopefully you can embed these incredible solutions in your educational endeavors. And just to obviously confirm, diversity relates to sex, gender, age, language, ethnicity, cultural background, and socioeconomic background, religious beliefs, career obligations, and even to the student's family, carer, and other responsibilities. And obviously we need to balance that with our studies, our work, and that obviously contributes to the diversity of our students. And at the moment, as we've found out over the last 4 hours, we've got quite an onslaught against university values and teaching, from academic misconduct, different competitors coming into the industry, and obviously ed tech and other high technology offerings. But I believe diversity, by focusing on diversity with our incredible students, we will have a huge value to offer going forward. And students are obviously better off when they embrace diversity, and obviously varied offerings make sure that we actually have some value to add to the equation going forward. So as I said, we've got 4 mind-blowing leaders. Professor Susan Page, Western Sydney University, she's Director of Indigenous Learning and Teaching. I've got Ms. Trish Mccluskey, Provost Chancellor of Victoria University, the VU block model she's going to talk about. Associate Professor Kelly Matthews, University of Queensland, and she's going to be talking about obviously partnership with students, but also, and this word has come up quite a few times, I noticed in the discussion, co-creation of materials or resources with students. And obviously, slightly out of the higher education space, perhaps the traditional area, is Ms. Liz Hughes, CEO of NIDA, and she's going to spend some time talking about her challenges, but also NIDA's Digital Theatre Festival in 2020. So the way we're going to work, and time is short as you would imagine, I'm going to give every speaker about 6 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to have a few questions for about 2-3 minutes, and then which I will obviously relay. So please bring up your questions. I will make sure we deal with each and every one of them. And then right at the end, we'll have about 5 to 6 minutes in which we will obviously try and pull it all together with a few other questions for the panel. And obviously, it's not just a talk fest. We're looking for spontaneity, so it's not choreographed too tightly, but you're going to hear from a formidable group. And I've brought an artifact along just to show everyone. This is my little tool of trade, a multimeter, which I measure volts and amps with, being that's my trade as an engineer. Unfortunately, over the last 18 months, with all the little ambiguities and nuances, this hasn't been too useful, and as you will see in the sessions coming up. So if I can launch Professor Susan Page with a quick bio, and then Susan, over to you if you can brace yourself. Professor Susan Page is an Aboriginal academic whose research focuses on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's experiences of learning, academic work and leadership in higher education, Indigenous studies, learning and teaching. Susan's current role is Director of Indigenous Learning and Teaching at the Western Sydney University. She has collaborated on several research grants and has received the National Award for Excellence in Teaching, the very well-known Neville Bonner Award, and is well published in the area of Indigenous higher education. So over to you, Susan, please, if you can take the mic, and I will.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thank you for that lovely heartfelt acknowledgement of country. I have my artefact is an Indigenous scarf. You can probably see it just there. It's really beautiful. It's made of beautiful cloth. And I guess I brought that just because there are a couple of Indigenous scholars, Kuokinen and a Noongar scholar, in fact, Bullen, who talks about Indigenous knowledges in the Academy as a gift. And my scarf was a gift from one of my colleagues. I treasure it. And of course, it raises consciousness and brings benefit to Indigenous artists. So I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, land on which learning and living has been taking place for many generations. I'm going to begin today with the story of a graduation. I love a graduation. I've been attending them regularly now for more than 20 years, probably longer. As a new academic, I attended graduations of students I had taught. Graduations were a big deal. Our boss expected academic staff to put on our caps and gowns and our Aboriginal sashes and join the procession to support and celebrate our students. Later, as the head of an Indigenous centre myself, I attended graduations for as many Indigenous students across the university as I could, sometimes 5, 6 or more graduations in a fortnight. In autumn 2020, we were looking forward to the graduation of one of our Indigenous PhD students at UTS, where I worked at that time. The successful culmination of years of work was something to honour. Well, you know what happened next. We had a graduation date, but no graduation. So we organised an online event to mark the occasion. Was it the same? Well, no, we do that pomp and ceremony for a reason. But we gathered family and friends and colleagues online. We made speeches and there was even some champagne, although not at my end, sadly. Did it make us tearful? Yes, and proud. Indigenous centres, and all universities have one, and Indigenous staff have been doing individualised support for Indigenous students for decades. Over that time, we've been assisting Indigenous students to navigate the often unfamiliar, sometimes alienating, and occasionally hostile environments that universities can be for Indigenous students. For us, being thoughtful of student experience is not new. What changed during the lockdown is the medium. We, like everybody else, switched to online. And here are some of the things that we did. It's a bit of a laundry list and there's a couple of stories in there. And then I'm going to come back at the end to leadership. So what did we do to make connections? Well, at WSU, every Indigenous student was allocated about an Army Student Support Officer for direct, ongoing, one-on-one communication, with regular fortnightly to 3-week contacts via phone, email or text. Elders in residence became a wonderful touch point for students at many universities. Some universities sent graduation gifts to the students who couldn't do a graduation ceremony. At UTS, we hastily convened a weekly online research seminar for our Indigenous PhD students and staff, with someone volunteering each week to present their work. And it was a great opportunity for catching up as well. Let's not talk about homeschooling. For some of our students studying at a distance, this was a real bonus. They were more connected than they'd previously been. Everyone was on Zoom, but not just them. So what about our practical support? Well, at WSU and UTS, that I know best, sent food parcels to students in need, and I'm sure lots of others did too. I know everyone had hardship funds, for example. We bolstered tech capability through things like providing dongles, who knew, and defraying internet costs. At WSU, our elders group received regular care packages, logistically tricky, I understand, in COVID, but involved shopping, packing, and shipping. And working through something as taken for granted as printing documents became a logistical problem to sort through. At WSU, Badnami staff liaised with our library staff. They arranged for students to be able to attend campus libraries, swipe their card, do their printing, and have the costs borne by the Indigenous Centre. Too easy, you say. What about the rural and regional students? Not a problem. Officeworks click and collect credits solved that problem. When all else failed, students who couldn't access Officeworks got their printing done by the director of Badnami and was posted out to them. What about innovations? Online events, trivia, movies, social media came into its own. Spotify song lists, anyone? At WSU, there were weekly $50 gift voucher raffles that were introduced, gave students something to look forward to. I know that ACU developed a project to create an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander online garden. At UTS, our HDR students connected up with a group of Pacifica and Māori postgraduate students to undertake a writing project. There was a writing project on managing in COVID, no less. It's unlikely that those students would have had the funding to get together physically, but COVID provided an opportunity to co-write, and they got a paper out of it and some new relationships. These are just some of the things our Indigenous centres and staff have been doing all around the nation. I'm sure there are loads of others that people in the audience can think of. I'm sorry, I don't have all of them. But returning to the conference questions, what will stay? Well, flexibility in our approaches, I hope. We might be all zoomed out, but I do think there are benefits of bringing people together who aren't on our campuses. We'll continue to strive to do the best for our Indigenous students at all levels. One of the big questions to the conference that the conference hopes to address is about developing leadership capabilities to embrace new opportunities. Great opportunity for me. We know that the pandemic has exacerbated inequity. Recently, there have been increasing prominence of Indigenous-led movements like Black Lives Matter, constitutional recognition, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which a number of universities signed up to. Universities are historically colonial institutions. It's our Indigenous senior leaders who are driving the realignment of the higher education sector to face away from these colonial mechanisms and ideologies that sustain racial inequality. It'd be remiss of me not to recognise that despite the pandemic and all that's gone on, we've recently had 3 new Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous positions announced in the sector. Ours at Western, congratulations to my colleague Michelle Trudgett, but also at Charles Darwin and James Cook. Congratulations to those universities for their vision and to my colleagues. And that's me. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much, Susan. And you're obviously passionate about the subject of, and you're obviously an Indigenous leader of note. I just want to ask, are there any questions? We've got a few questions out there. I mean, Susan, probably one of the important questions is, how did your Indigenous students handle the challenges with the internet and all the basic day-to-day stuff?
So look, different students have had different problems, I think that would be safe to say. Some students are really well organised with their tech. Lots of our Indigenous students are really well organised with the tech. But the key thing was that for those students who weren't organised with tech, then the Indigenous centres were there. I'm sure I could speak for all the centres around the countryside. I know many of my colleagues who have been dealing with this. Certainly the ones I know of at UTS and Western Sydney were, supporting students by sometimes paying their internet, sometimes, providing access to equipment, etc. Those kinds of things. But energy is put into that, definitely.
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much, Susan. There were comments about socioeconomic disadvantages, but that's great. Thanks so much, Susan. We'll come back to you near the end. I just want to obviously introduce Trish Mccluskey as our next speaker. Sorry, everything's a bit pushed here, but time-wise, as we said, Associate Provost Learning and Teaching and Director of Connected Learning at Victoria University, instrumental in introducing the very famous, well-known VU block model, which is very widely promoted over the last year. And it's a radical reconceptualization of traditional university curriculum. She's an award-winning teacher and educational leader, has worked across the full spectrum of tertiary education in New Zealand and Australia. So over to you, Trish, if you can unmute your mic and give us a quick rundown on your activities in good old Melbourne.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm joining you today from the unceded Wurundjeri lands here in Melbourne, where I live, learn and work. And I also pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I brought along today a Rubik's Cube. Well, it's not a real Rubik's Cube because they're actually a bit more expensive. It's one I got in the $2 shop. It represents the work that I and my colleagues have been immersed in at Victoria University for the past 4 years. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the block model. This represents the complexity of the block model, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. It was a whole of university change process and has many moving parts and many, many twists and turns, especially over the past 2 years. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the block model, I'd just like to provide a little snapshot. So at VU, we fundamentally changed the way students undertake their study in higher education by offering the units one at a time, sequentially over a semester, rather than 4 units concurrently. There was no reduction in the duration or the depth of the learning in the units. They were just restructured into a more intensive and immersive learning experience. This eradicates the need for students to juggle multiple units, multiple deadlines, multiple room changes and timetables. And the focus very much is on student engagement and belonging. So classes are small to create learning communities with one academic leading who gets to know the students well over the 4 weeks together, and the students get to know each other in a small group and gets to know the academic as well. The learning environment has also changed, and we've moved classes away from lecture theatres to a merged modality mode of collaborative physical and virtual spaces. The assessment is now intentionally designed to be engaging, to be real-world relevant and task-focused, and staged over the course of the block. So large terminal assessments and exams are discouraged. So we introduced this wonderful block thing, and it was very successful, and it got rave reviews, and the students loved it. Our student results and retention rates went through the roof. Then along came COVID, and of course hit us harder here in Melbourne than many other states. So how did we cope? As we always do, with great good humour and goodwill from the Victoria University community. So we were pleasantly surprised after the initial shock reaction. And because we had invested the time and the resources into the block design, we were able to seamlessly move to the virtual environment. People talked about pivoting to remote. We found that we sort of pirouetted slightly, and we're trying not to be smug about that, but we were thinking, how come this didn't disrupt us when we'd actually had something new and unique, and we thought, oh, here we go, just when we're getting it right at VU, along comes something that's going to derail us. So we had already built the digital capability and fluency of our staff. We had already built the digital capability and fluency of our students who had engaged in the block. And we had a very clear focus on communications with the students in that digital space about what happens before class, what happens during class, and what happens after class. So it was very much an existing merged modality anyway. So we were pleased that with our students' evaluations, because they actually have remained relatively steady and significantly improved since we introduced the model. So how did the students cope with this change? They, some students who'd been into their second year of the block model, and we were looking forward to a big graduation in year 3. And unfortunately, like I've heard echoed here a lot today, we didn't have our graduation and our celebration of the success of the model. But the students were already very familiar with the digital platform. So that had been very carefully designed to be clear, consistent, and logical. And every unit looked and felt the same, and all learning resources were uploaded a week prior to them starting their block, so they could get a head start and become familiar with it. The only thing that really changed was we introduced Zoom. And Zoom gloom did take hold pretty quickly, and trying to work with students and staff to say, well, just because we had 3 hours of collaborative time in a classroom when we were on campus didn't mean that the 3 hours needed to be locked to a camera and that students had to attend the screen. So some of the students, you know, it's very difficult when we're trying to engage students, but starting the community meeting in the Zoom space, but not necessarily having to stay there, and letting them either go off into breakout rooms to work on projects together or to go and do a task and then come back. But it was almost like the Zoom classroom was the space where people returned to during that period of time to seek help from their peers or to seek help from the academics. One of the good things about the block is that students can drop a block if they needed to have a break and join 4 weeks later, which gave them a bit of a space. And a lot of students we find actually did that. If a student drops out during a semester model, they lose 4 units, and sometimes it can take a year before they can recover that. So that was actually quite useful for students who might have been stressed out by what was happening in the pandemic, with family responsibilities, those sorts of things. So how did our staff cope? Again, we had invested significant resources in building the staff's digital pedagogy and fluency. So some of the staff, just like our students, they struggled. You know, it was, how do we do things differently? Do I have to see every student's face? Do we have to have the cameras on? But also a lot of our staff were struggling with their own responsibilities at home, trying to homeschool as well as teach and engage students. So I think that they had probably a good understanding of what the challenges were that the students were facing. One of the things that I stress that we learned from this, and I think it has perhaps been underplayed, is the importance of caring for our staff as well as students and making sure that they are well resourced, because some of our staff were working with, you know, very old laptops perhaps, or didn't have 2 screens, or didn't have the ability to do that sort of activity. So making sure that we had timely, well-resourced professional learning on tap when they needed it. Some of the challenges that we've had probably were related to Zoom, and the preference for students in particular for recording sessions. And these were some students perhaps who had merged from a traditional model, you know, because we're still rolling this out. So there was a request that Zoom sessions get recorded. That was a massive issue for us because people weren't fully fluent, especially at the beginning. And therefore we had a number of instances of Zoom bombing, you know, where someone hacked in, dropped into a class and started making disparaging comments to students. And, you know, I saw an example of that where an academic handled it beautifully. And I also saw an example of where it wasn't managed so well. So what will we do going forward? Will we retain some of the things that we've learned? Absolutely. I think that we are now perhaps going to look at some units being delivered in 2 different modes if we have sufficient enrollments. Perhaps students have more choice. They can choose whether they do an online hybrid model or whether they actually come onto campus. Students do have preferences. And if we have significant enrollment for a course, that will work really well. But if not, it might be a bit of a challenge. I think I might have used up all my time. Have I, Steve? I could talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles about the block and what it's been like.
Thanks so much, Trish. No, it's we're on time, but obviously time's always racing ahead. But certainly, obviously, some of I suppose the dominant questions that are coming out of that block mode are, what are you going to do next year, which is going to be different, I suppose, in essence? Is there anything that an institution in, say, Western Australia or South Australia can take away from your block mode experiences for next year?
I think anyone who's going to introduce it as a model, and there are a number of universities doing that both in Australia and internationally, it needs to be a whole of organisation approach. And I think that's the same going forward with what we've learned from the the pandemic and how we've coped with the pandemic using the block model is very much about there's no one way, there's no one size fits all. And I think we heard that from some of our students this morning as well. So it's about trying to customize it, trying to ascertain the needs of the staff and the needs of students and the needs of the topic area, you know, because some units, of course, do require campus attendance and laboratory activities.
Thanks, Trish. Yes, certainly you're quite right. If it's not a whole of organisation experience, if everyone doesn't buy into it, all hell will break loose later. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the Rubik Cube. You made my day, my morning. Thank you very much. It's
Problem is I can't solve it yet.
Don't look at me as an engineer. I'm useless with those things. Can I now jump in and welcome our next passionate speaker, Kelly Matthews. If I can give her a quick bio, and away we go. Is Associate Professor of Higher Education, University of Queensland, so a bit further north than Mckay in Melbourne. She is an internationally recognised expert in engaging students as partners and student voice in higher education. Kelly's latest 2 books speak to her expertise, writing about learning and teaching in higher education, and the other is Advanced HE Higher Education Guidebook called Student Partnerships and Assessment. She's a thought leader in higher education who gives voice to the experience of students and teachers so we can better understand how to grow cultures of care and meaningful interactions across the higher education community. And in particular, she is passionate about student co-creation, which, as I said, has been a topic. And there have been a few other questions coming up for Susan, which we will come back to at the end of the session, so if you can hang in there. So over to you, Kelly, please do your magic, and I will mute and let you go for it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks very much, Steve. I would also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, and First Nations people with us here today. It is an absolute pleasure to be here amongst this panel and the conversations happening all day. I would like to ask everyone, if you can, in the chat that's running next to your screen here as you're watching, if you could identify your role in the university, academic, students, whatever that role might be, or within industry. And I'm thinking about what Carrie Lee Krause was telling us this morning about your anchor points, or what I would call your core values that really came out in times of COVID, what you think really matters. So if you could share your role and your anchor point or your core values that really resonate, that stick with you now because of COVID. So put that into the chat. And the reason I'm getting us to think about this is because Steve asked us all to bring an artifact, which I thought was a fantastic idea. But one of the artifacts that has stuck with me over the last 2 years is less a material thing and about how to build relationships through the medium of Zoom. And it's something I've struggled with and I've learned a lot about. So I wanted to bring that artifact into this. It's great to see just the diversity and the mixture of people that are here listening to us, and then what their core values are, what's really sticking with you. And I'm thinking about what George was telling us this morning. We had all of these stats and we had all of these figures and numbers, and it was fascinating, decades of trends about immigration and migration. And then he said, and when they get here, right? Our international students and our students, when they get here, we look after them. And that's where I want to bring us in this conversation. And I'm picking up on Susan and Trish as well. When they get here, how do we care for them? So I have spent the morning Zoom jumping. I would not recommend it, but I've been moving between the National Students as Partners Roundtable, where 400 plus students, staff, and teachers have been sharing case studies and practices about how we engage as partners in this process of co-creation. And I'm jumping between the TEXA conference here today. But what I really heard in the Students as Partners session over the last 3 days is people really grappling seriously with how we do this partnership and work in a way that makes education, higher education, more inclusive, more welcoming, and more responsive to the diverse needs, motivations, and circumstances of our students and staff. And I think that's core to what we're talking about here today. And so for me, that event in some ways is a snapshot of the future. It's a middle out community. It's not sponsored by one university. No vice chancellor sanctions it. It is about a movement of people coming together, students, staff, teachers, saying, how do we do this differently? And what that speaks to me is about the importance of relationships. So when I think about how we move forward with COVID and how we think about the everyday lived experiences of what it means to be on a university campus or on universities online or whatever mode we move into next, the key thing we've got to think about are those relationships. So what I'm going to be talking about really is a relationship revolution in higher education. That's what I see our next decade really being about, that relationality, the way that everybody is seen, valued, and heard and accepted for who they are. And I want to pick up on one of Susan's points here too, because I thought she said this so perfectly. It's a gift. When we see and value and recognize people for what they bring, the knowledges that they can contribute, that is a gift to our university environments and our university communities and the people within them. So I'm not trying to be provocative here, but it might sound a little provocative to some, not to others. I think what we really need to be thinking about moving forward in the next decade is the cultures we want to create around interactions and cares on our campuses, in our universities, in the environments, again, wherever they are. And so part of that's thinking about the language that we use. I think we need to see a shift from talking about delivering content and knowledge as if you can call and order it, to realizing it's a social interaction, and that the ways that learning transforms people's lives is when learners and teachers are grappling and thinking and interacting. And I think COVID has made that clear. And that interacting has to be combined with care. So how are we caring, and what's our responsibility for those interactions? And then I also want to push back a little bit at this idea that students are at the heart, or students are our most important stakeholders, because I want to pick up on Trish's point. It's about students and staff together. If we think about that relationship and those interactions, there can't be cared if the people who are supposed to do the caring aren't cared for. So we really need to think about the relationships and how that helps us to move forward. So I want to talk a little bit about the University of Queensland. We haven't got this right. It's never going to be perfect. We're talking about human relationships in learning and teaching, but there has been an unwavering ethos and a healthy commitment to debate around the relationships that we want our students and our staff to have. And underpinning that is very much about research. So we've got a great research agenda happening at the University of Queensland that I'm thrilled to be a part of. We're trying to understand what intercultural or cross-cultural partnership looks like inside and outside of the classroom. We are trying to also understand what it means for teaching staff, particularly teaching focused staff, their lived experiences of teaching, and what they then need to have the time and space to form these relationships. Because co-creation cannot work if our teaching staff aren't a part of this with us. And so when we think about this idea of engaging students as partners in co-creation of learning, teaching, assessment, as well as student life, that's where we need to focus our attention, the quality of those relationships. And when we think about technology, the question, I think, when it comes to the technological tools and the digitization that we need and the uplifts, always has to come back to this question: how are the technologies that we're using and the policies that we're going to develop going to create the types of trustworthy and meaningful and genuine relationships that we need to see for learning and teaching moving forward? And why is this so important to me? Because if we keep thinking about higher education as a place that just delivers content and knowledge, we're going to put ourselves out of business. We are in the business of transforming lives and peoples. A video is never going to replace a teacher. So we've got to think about how we create those interactions with the flexibility that allows us to see diversity and inclusion as a gift, and with us facing up to the fact that our university systems have been built to better serve some students than others. And I'll end with this note. The last 3 days in the Students as Partners Roundtable has also reminded me of the joy that this work can bring to students and staff. And I don't know about you all, but I definitely need some joy moving forward in the workplace. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That was really marvelous. And I really appreciate the way you synthesized the other two speakers' contribution and put yours in. That's a real art when you're under stress with internet and online. Thank you very much. Just from a practical point of view, I mean, what tips would you give, say, a university or a college about co-creating with students? How do you ensure the quality of the experience is maintained? People will say, well, students obviously are learning. They can't possibly know more than the lecturers and stuff like that. How would you keep the quality going in the experience?
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. In some ways, I think this comes back to the last session where I think Alistair was talking about, well, it depends what you mean by partnership, and it depends who's a partner, but in a very different context. The key thing about partnership is the ways that universities and providers are going to do this has to work for their context and the culture that they want to create. So it first needs to be understood as an ethos with values, mutual respect, reciprocity, and the people involved saying, what are the values that actually matter here? It's not just one practice or one program. And from there, then it's about bringing together students and staff and teachers to say, okay, how do we enact these? What do we want to look like this? Because it's not about scaling up one partnership program. It's actually about an ecology and a cultural shift around what does it mean to have the quality of these relationships. And you've got to keep coming back to checking in on the quality of those relationships. Thanks
so much, Kelly. We're going to just move on to Liz. So she's got time to tell us in a completely different area. And thank you very much. There's a few questions coming through, so I'll save those to the end of the session. So Liz, if I can quickly give you a brief bio of your career. Liz Hughes, CEO of NIDA, who's going to join us now online. Highly experienced, innovative, senior executive in the creative arts, cultural, education sectors. She commenced a leadership role as CEO of NIDA just before the pandemic, before everything went pear-shaped. She's ensured NIDA continues to build on its world-renowned creative education while embracing opportunities for disruption. Liz is a positive transformational leader and change maker and specializes in collaboration and partnerships, which you will see when she was telling me about partnering with Los Angeles. So people in Los Angeles. She's committed to harnessing the unique qualities of NIDA's education, making it accessible and inclusive for a talented and diverse range of individuals, and extending the possibilities of the performing arts in all its guises, and I love this, across stages, screens, and beyond. She's held senior executive roles at the ATRS, Australian Film, Television and Radio School, which is very well known, where she transformed external engagement. And she's held in numerous other arts leadership roles, including positions in higher education, part of public programs in remote Indigenous communities, and as a board director. She's also an award-winning filmmaker. So over to you, Liz, and if you can unmute and let us hear your story.
Thank you very much. I've actually written down some words because I will talk for too long, I know that. So if you bear with me, I will try and keep to time. So look, it's just terrific to be here. Really fantastic presentation so far. I actually connect to all of them, and I feel like all of them are very connected to what we do at NIDA. Firstly, I'd like to start off by acknowledging that at NIDA, we're here on Gadigal and Bidjigal land of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to very, very respectfully extend that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders with us in this important conversation today. So my journey at NIDA started just before the pandemic, and I'd come in with a pretty big to-do list. So very soon after walking in the door, I realised that I had arrived at a very special place where almost every day I'd witness a moment of almost creative magic, and I just wanted to sort of bottle it up. I soon realised that in many ways, for the many of the creative sector, NIDA was where it all begins. Many of the writers, directors, set designers, actors, costume props and set makers that bring to life the content we see on stages, screens and beyond started at NIDA. And those alumni are literally everywhere. So I passionately wanted to sort of harness the awesome creative DNA of NIDA and at the same time support its evolution and modernisation. My priorities when I started were increasing the diversity and inclusion at NIDA, encouraging a greater exploration with technology in creative storytelling, supporting creative and diverse voices, harnessing entrepreneurial skills, and creating greater access to NIDA's education. and of course, making sure that we were financially sustainable. For those that don't know, NIDA has both TEX accreditation and ASCO accreditation, so we're a dual provider. So I was in the role literally for a few weeks before getting a sense that the virus was going to be a big challenge. NIDA is mostly an in-person practice-based learning offering, and we had to move with the times very quickly. Moving embodied training online was absolutely imperative. At NIDA, many people didn't have things like laptops, web cameras, many had never done a Skype call. So there were quite a few hurdles on many fronts for us to sort of overcome very quickly. NIDA has a lot of creative production embedded in its curriculum, very much practice-based. So the first thing we did was started to collaborate with the students. I really resonate with the comments about co-creation because that's pretty much what we did. For anyone who's part of NIDA, who knows NIDA, they understand that the magic that the creative and ambitious students bring to the organisation is really considerable. So we literally went, not quite shoulder to shoulder because of social distancing, but we literally went side by side, myself and the president of the student union. And we went to address groups of students to let them know the news that we had to close the NIDA campus, we had to go home and work out a way to teach and learn remotely. Many students were absolutely devastated, especially it was their third year. It was the time when they were going to have their major work in their degree, and it was heartbreaking. So we took a moment. I did a huge amount of listening and talking, and I offered to the students two options: to do nothing and see when this thing called COVID would end and be kind of a victim to the situation and be passive, or to kind of grab the opportunity with both hands, grab the opportunity of the disruption and to invent the future of the performing arts. And I was very happy that they went for the latter option. And I believe what they learned and what they experienced has changed them for the better. The first big challenge was to work out how to deliver a comparable learning experience. Instead of our traditional June production to season, which is, a big deal, has 150 plus students working on it across all of the different cohorts. What we did was we created a digital theatre festival with 6 productions on virtual platforms. So, YouTube, Twitch, etc., etc. Each production had to be developed and produced online, had to have strong creative outcomes, and we needed a creative lead for each production. Our brilliant director in residence, David Berthold, found 6 creative lead artists. They came up with an idea each, and they had to work within the constraints. It had to be delivered online, they had to be rehearsed, created, everything about it was virtual. And they worked with a whole range of disciplines, including the actors, stage managers, costume makers, lighting designers, sound designers, props makers, set designers, and they did everything remotely through Zoom. And they did an incredible job with 6 fantastic productions. So I'll just give you an example of one, and I think Steve has actually just mentioned the first person. We had one production directed by Emmy Award-winning Sean Stewart, who suddenly found himself available. The production was called Roundabout, which we opened on a gaming platform, Twitch. And it was a love triangle, 3 actors, 6 characters. The actors were given a 350-page script, which they had to learn very quickly. And also he wrote it very quickly too. And then the audience would, basically throughout the production, the audience would actually have a chat on the side of the, in the Twitch platform. And they would actually be able to vote in terms of what character each of the actors played. And we did around 6 performances for the Sydney and Los Angeles time zones. That was because Sean was based in Los Angeles. Each performance was completely unique as the audience controlled the choices of the narrative. And towards the end of the 5th or 6th production, the actors had the chat stream brought really into their view, and they started to improvise with the narrative and incorporate what people were saying on the chat into the performance. So if someone said a glass or a banana or whatever, that would sort of come into the narrative as well. So it was an amazing production, all created remotely, and it really showed the power of NIDA's teaching and actually the incredible innovation of the students and the staff and the team and ability to adapt. Another production was a 2-hour live sci-fi performance with multiple cameras and actually my artifact, the sound effect being dropped in live. I was blown away to see the tech wizardry driving the production, and to the point of collaborating with students, sometimes the students knew more about different innovations in technology than others did. So it was fantastic to have that collaboration. Another production was shot entirely by individual students on their phones, the second artefact. And that was called Lockdown. It was an incredibly powerful narrative that really captured that moment in time. It had the raw energy. And what also happened was, I think, in the traditional kind of structures of productions were dismantled, because the students became kind of really much the collaborators with the creative leads, and any sort of traditional hierarchy in a way was broken down. The expedited learning was incredible across all the courses that NIDA offers, obviously including technology, innovation, screen practice, courageous storytelling, and of course, working under enormous pressure. The resilience of the students was impressive, and this resilience continues. The students easily collaborated with creative artists, so that hierarchy was dismantled. The industry collaborations that were built during the pandemic have lasted, and there's an example. So one of the technical theatre stage management alumni continues to collaborate with LA-based Sean Stewart and international creators of games and interactive media companies. And he juggles 3 time zones because he's working in Sydney, he's working in the US and the UK. He's incredibly grateful for the adversity that the pandemic has created. I believe that performance schools such as NIDA will be the breeding ground of the next vanguard of innovation in the game sector. And in a way, we had a little glimpse into that through the pandemic as well, where we were forced to think differently. I learned a lot during this time. I appreciated the special NIDA creative DNA at this moment, and realised how well actually performance training prepares prepares everyone in dealing for the pandemic. And we were very grateful at NIDA to have that background. So performance training at the core embraces improvisation, engaging with audiences in many different forms, not always linear forms too. And there's a kind of an entrepreneurial spirit of throwing it all together, no matter what the adversity, and kind of getting the show on the road. And that attitude enabled us to put on this this digital theatre festival in July, when we could have been sitting around and not doing very much. And it was fantastic to see that. Just think I'm going with time there, Steve. Shall I? I'm still going, okay. I also think that, look, performance training is kind of about life skills training, and the skills that are taught are mostly found in the top 10 of the skills that people talk about for the future of work. And we're very proud that at NIDA, that's what we set the students up for. So just briefly, over the last 18 months, there's been other fantastic opportunities for transformation, and we're very much focused on having an inclusive learning environment at NIDA. And through the conversations that came up through the BLM movement, we managed to actually push forward our focus on creating an inclusive learning environment, and sort of shifting the goalposts, and pretty much having a multi-pronged approach to really committing to diversity in a really real powerful way. So I just want to acknowledge that was actually a really welcome conversation, and it was actually very happy to expedite that work, which is obviously still a long way to go. We also addressed mental health in a big way, and I employed several psychologists last year and counsellors to assist and mentor students as they went through often very challenging journeys at NIDA, often about personal life, often about the environment, and things that were coming up that were deep and powerful and needed support. So look, thanks for inviting me here today. Just a few takeaways. Yes, co-creation with students and ensuring they have agency is completely critical. And it's the way it must be. It's the most exciting way for education to go forward. We choose people at NIDA through a huge amount of applicants, and those people that come through are pretty exceptional. So working with them, listening, and sort of navigating with them, I think is really fantastic. Lean in to embrace opportunities of this disrupted world. I'm always thinking about, if there's a problem, well, what's the opportunity on the other side? And there's been many opportunities of things that we will keep from the pandemic. Choosing a positive frame with the students, I often address the students saying, look, there's 2 options. You can't change the situation, but if you take a positive frame and just decide to see it in that way, it'll be better. And performance training sets you up with all the essential skills that you need. It doesn't matter what sector you're in.
Thanks so much, Liz, and really your passion shines out. Just one question, it's a little bit off the panel here. What film did you produce?
I actually I produced quite a few films, but the one that's probably most well known is called Cat's Cradle. And it's about a family who can't afford to bury their dead, and they have to find an alternative way to dispose of his corpse in a respectful, loving way.
Oh, that's very good. Thank you very much, Liz. That's a fantastic. Your passion shines out, and obviously the tips and tricks, the stuff that you've done, we need to apply in our boring lecture university models as well. So thank you very much for that. I've got a zillion questions here. I'm just going to ask the panel now, if you don't mind. I'm just going to ask the ones I can. The first one is Susan, for you, from Daniel Scripita. It says here, this is from the chat, not from the questions actually, are there questions around identifying Indigenous students? Are you relying on students to come to you, or do you reach out? So over to you, Susan, if you've got 30 seconds to a minute.
30 seconds. We reach out. Yeah, so when students enroll at universities, they can choose to identify. So those are the students that we reach out to. So we reach out to those students. Most centres would do that. And sometimes we get students along the way who identify, who might not have done it initially because they were worried for various reasons, but sometimes we catch those in various ways in our teaching programs, etc.
Thanks very much, Susan.
We don't wait.
And then there's another question for you. I'll quickly grasp. Teaching Indigenous students during the pandemic. A couple of Indigenous students need to use campus computers due to license issues of the software provided. How do you deal with that? I suppose that's a question probably, but you probably don't deal with it directly. Your IT department does. Yeah, their computers, how do they set them up?
They set them up just like everyone else would be my guess. But you know, some students might not have tech. Probably most students do have tech. Some rural and remote sometimes can be an issue, but lots of our students are in cities as well. Yeah, maybe that's the answer to that question.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks, Susan. That's great. And then I've got a question here for you, Trish. I know you've got some bandwidth challenges, but persist, please, for the last 10 minutes, 5 minutes. What did your staff say about the block mode model? Did it introduce spike of workloads? And I suppose over to you, Trish.
Yes, most staff embraced it enthusiastically, and of course there was a spike in workloads as with any new model. You know, so staff had to put extra time into unpacking existing units and repackaging them into blocks. Most staff who have actually got into their stride have found that there are ways to more efficiently engage students, more efficiently develop and assess online. So we've introduced a lot of digital tools like H5P, you know, that will actually save time in terms of assessment and marking and automation. We've also completely automated all of our results processing. So it's swings and roundabouts. You know, some staff who are really passionate about learning put in extra hours, and there are some who are struggling to keep the balance with research and teaching, which is also a challenge. So I don't think it's like the students, there isn't one size fits all. And we have some staff who've come to VU because they wanted to teach in the block mode, and we have some staff who've left VU because they found it too difficult.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Trish. I've just got another question here. There's quite a few here. Let's just go for this one here.
Happy to take them on notice.
There's a question here. How do you, here we are. How do you encourage, okay, Kelly, here's a question for you, Kelly. I'll come back to Trish if I've got time. Kelly, how do you think we can encourage more students to participate in students as partner programs? So in other words, how do you get students involved? From Bailey Wemyss.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks for the question. My sense is one way to think about this, first of all, is that students as partners can be many, many practices. So it can happen in and out of the classroom. And secondly, I think one of the key questions we need to be thinking about is which students and how do we involve and make partnership open and comfortable and safe for students who have been least well served. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from Susan in this space and thinking about relationality in that. So in some ways, I think I might hand over to Susan.
Over to you, Susan.
I've got it. Sometimes you just can't get that button to work.
Thanks.
Now. Look, co-creation and students as partners is not actually an area where I have a lot of strength, but I certainly am thinking about that because Western Sydney does have a lot of strength in this area. And certainly one of the things I've been thinking about is, exactly that. How do we get Indigenous students involved? Because, we want to involve lots of students, not just those really high achievers who see it as a great thing to be doing, students as partners. And so I don't have the answer, but I certainly am thinking about this. And I think, if we really are going to do co-creation and students and partners, then it can't just be the kind of elite, highly motivated students. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Susan. I'm going to cheat a bit. I've got a question for one of our staff members, Natalie, for Kelly. Sorry, Trish, actually. Have you received data from feedback from industry, Trish, on students that are working in industry pursuing undergrad degrees online? Would this suit this model, or is it mainly for school leavers? Over to you, Trish, if you're still with us. She may have dropped out. I think she's dropped out, unfortunately. She's got a few internet problems. Okay, what I'll do is wrap up because we've obviously got very little time left. I just want to thank the panel for giving me an incredible experience, and I suppose you guys all shown remarkable leadership and persistence in a very trying time in your different areas, in the diverse areas that you're operating in. So I just want to thank you very, very much for preparing, coming along, and sharing your passion and leadership with all of us. So I really appreciate that. And I just want to thank Texa and the inimitable Justine Baranowskis for getting 1,000 people together today. I mean, it's a remarkable feat for an online session, 1,000 people together to reflect on the last 18 months. And it's been a really, really positive scene that we've had today. A few little negative twiddly bits, but generally, I think it's a very proactive, positive look at the 2022 coming up. But certainly the perspective from Susan in the Indigenous area, Liz with NIDA and the incredible dramatic collaboration with Los Angeles is just mind-blowing. And obviously Kelly with the passion for co-creation is with students, is to look at students not as clients but as partners is really great. And obviously Trish with her passion, she's obviously not with us at the moment because of the vagaries of the internet, but Trish and her passion for block mode, it shines through. So there are a few other questions here which we'll bring up. We'll have to ask you after the session. So once again, 000, thank you very much, one and all, for giving me a wonderful morning of thinking. Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.